Welcome to The Intentional Exit, a leadership legacy podcast for those who don't just want to retire, but want to do it well. I'm Rebecca Schriver, and this is where we help you protect what you've built, reduce unnecessary taxes, and create a plan that gives you clarity, confidence, and control. So together, we make sure your exit is not accidental, it's intentional. Before we begin, please note that the information shared in this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as tax, legal, or financial advice. For guidance specific to your situation, we recommend consulting with a qualified professional. Hi, I'm Rebecca Schriver, and I will be your host for The Intentional Exit. So this is our very first podcast episode, and as such, I think it's kind of important that we talk about the big picture, like what are we doing here? So as people move from the accumulation portion of their life into distribution, there's a lot of questions that happen. There's a lot of anxiety around it. And it's rightfully so, right? So when we're talking about this, we are taking this shift from I'm working, I have an active income that I go to, work every day and I'm earning this money, to all of a sudden we're kind of shutting that faucet off and moving into distribution, where we start to look at those assets that we've accumulated, or maybe we're selling off a business and we have this chunk of money that we're now going to live off of. And whether you're getting ready to do this at 35 or 40 or 50 or 65 or 70, it's still the same thing, right? We're still trying to figure out how to maximize those dollars to make sure that you have enough money to live off of, and that you're not going to end up in a situation where all of a sudden you don't have enough. I always ask my clients, I say, listen, what do you want to last longer? Your life or your money? And most people, that takes them back a little bit, right? They're going, wait a second, why are you asking me what I want to last longer, my life or my money? But when you really start to think about it, it's a very important question. So we've got our life that we don't necessarily want to cut short, but we also don't want to get to a position in life where we're trying to figure out all of a sudden, how do I make sure that I have enough money? How do I make sure that I pay the bills? How do I make sure that I'm able to feed myself and get the medications that I need? If you have a family, how am I going to take care of them, or my spouse? And so there's a lot of things that can come along the path that will kind of disrupt that. And so when we're looking at the intentional exit and how do we exit gracefully, we are really focused in on all of these things that maybe you didn't know were going to come along. All of these things that maybe showed up in a weird way. So the first thing that, is obvious, maybe it's not so obvious, but I think it's obvious, is we now have to replace that income. So you can have a giant bucket of money. If you're talking about a lottery winner, right? They went out and they won millions of dollars and it's gone like that, right? So all of a sudden you turn around and it's completely gone. And that's because having a giant bucket of money does not equal success. What it equals is, gosh, we have this big bucket of money, and if we spend it too fast, then we may run out and we may have to return to work or be poor. Or, as far as if you have a steady stream of income that shows up reliably each and every year, then you'll never be poor. And so having income can be more important in distribution than having a bucket of money. And so there's value to both. So before you turn me off and you're like, hey, I don't want to listen to this lady, she's crazy. Let's just balance it out. Let's talk about both sides so that we can make sure that you are doing the very best that you can possibly do. The other thing that most people don't think about is taxes. So whenever you were working and maybe you were contributing to a 401k because somebody told you should, you went into HR or whomever, and maybe your parents or your sibling or a friend told you, hey, are you contributing to a 401k? Yes, I am. Great. And then you get the company match, which is free money, which is amazing. Don't ever turn down free money. But when you're doing that, you're also creating kind of this tax bomb, right? So as you put it in, it's a tax deduction, right? So every year you get a reduced amount of income, and they told you that there was going to be a reduced amount of taxes in retirement, but they lied, okay? So most people don't realize that if you defer the taxes down the road, for most people, now not everybody, but for most people, that tax burden actually doesn't come down, because even though your earnings may be less, what you're spending is kind of the same, right? So you still need a certain amount of money to live off of, and you still need a certain amount to come out. Well, if it's coming out of a taxable account, not only is that account going to be taxed, but it also may have this triggering event where all of the sudden you're being taxed on Social Security where otherwise you might not have been taxed on it. So there's this MAGI calculation where they determine whether 50% of your Social Security is taxable or 85% of your Social Security is taxable. And now, it doesn't mean that they're taking away 50% of your Social Security or 85% of your Social Security. It just means that now that percentage all of the sudden is going to be taxed, where if you had maybe arranged things a little bit differently, it would have never been taxed. You wouldn't have had to worry about it. And so as we're working on this and as we're talking about this, there are all of these little triggers, right? There's all these little breakpoints where if you fall just below them, you don't experience taxes or you don't experience additional expense. But if you go above them, all of a sudden, not only are you being taxed on that distribution, which is what we're talking about, of that money coming out of your 401k or your IRA, but now you're also getting an additional tax on Social Security. And I know, man, it's all over the news, right? And every time I see it, I just want to go, except, right? Like, where's your disclaimer at the bottom? Why are you able to stand up there and say these things and not have the disclaimer at the bottom? But we have the big, beautiful bill, and it did some really wonderful things. So before you think that I'm saying the big, beautiful bill is awful, that is not the case. There were some big tax breaks that came along in there, but they touted that Social Security was now not taxable, right? So we're removing taxes from Social Security. We got rid of them. Kind of, right? So they reduced them. I'll give them that. But for 80% of the population, sure, you're no longer going to be taxed on Social Security. For the rest of you who did really well, you get to pay taxes on Social Security, because not only are you a higher income earner, which means you've maximized your Social Security, which means you've paid a ton in, right? You paid a tremendous amount in. As a matter of fact, you're pushing up into the top levels of Social Security. But now, whenever you add on what you did a great job of saving, it creates this triggering event where your Social Security is now taxed too. So where it may be that your IRA or 401ks, you're pulling it out, is being taxed at that 22% tax bracket. You also triggered taxes on your Social Security that were voluntary because you didn't know how to do it differently. And so then those voluntary taxes may make that feel more like 30%. Because otherwise, if you had done things differently or if you had organized differently, not only would we be reducing those taxes on the money that you put in or the money that you're taking out, because we're kind of past that putting in point, but on that money that you're taking out, but you also wouldn't have created a triggering event on the Social Security. Now, this can also be true for if you've got interest in dividends and stocks and bonds, and you've got cap gains and these other things. So it's not a one-trick pony. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It's very important that whenever you're doing this, that you sit down and look at your particular situation. Do not look at somebody else's situation and be like, oh, well, mine's exactly the same. It may or may not be. Even if I have somebody who earned this amount of money, who's getting this much Social Security, that has this much sitting in savings or in retirement, it doesn't mean that their outlook looks exactly the same. Maybe they are going to live longer. Maybe they're going to have a different lifestyle. What is that lifestyle going to look like? Are they going to be somebody who sits at home and lives off of Social Security only, and they're not going to use their IRA? Well, great, except for the fact that the IRS and the federal government, they have a plan for you. So even if you're somebody who's like, I live very frugally, I don't spend that much money, I don't even know if I'm going to need my 401k or IRA, I'm just growing it for my kids. Great. The IRS has a plan for you. They saw you coming. They said, you know what? We are going to put into place this thing called an RMD, or required minimum distribution, where they're actually going to take a percentage and force that amount of money out to you every single year once you hit a certain age. And it's on a sliding scale. The bottom age right now is 73. But also with the Secure Act, they did some other kind of tricky, sneaky things. So you'll hear people say, oh, they gave us a break. They moved it up from 70 and a half to 73. And actually they started at 72 and then they moved it to 73. But when they did that, they also compressed down the amount of time that an inherited IRA can be distributed. Now, whether that's a 401k, 403b, TSP, it doesn't matter. It's pre-tax dollars. But as those dollars come out from an inherited standpoint, I am not talking about the marital bubble. This is not husband to wife. This is not wife to husband or spouse to spouse, or however you want to look at that. That's the marital bubble. So that transfer looks very similar to you've always owned it. It looks exactly like it is yours. However, once you get outside of that marital bubble and we start looking at transferring that to the next generation or even to a sibling, they're on a very specific time clock where they have to empty that account over a 10-year time period, which means that you are now forcing this money out even faster, and most likely that individual is still working. So if that individual is still working, and let's say they're sitting in a 22 or 24% tax bracket, we are now taking those dollars and stacking them on top, because taxes work kind of like a graduated cylinder. We start out and these dollars are taxed at 12%, then these dollars are taxed at 22, then these are at 24, and then these are at 32. That's a big hop, and then 35. And so if they're filling up those tax brackets, the 12, the 22, even into the 24 with their working money, and then all of a sudden we're tacking on top your IRA because they have to take that distribution over a 10-year time period and they don't have a choice, then we are drastically increasing the amount of money that the federal government gets. Right? Somebody in a back office had a calculator. And when they were working on this, they were very smart. They said, okay, great. We're going to delay for those people who are really frugal. They've saved a ton of money. Then we're going to, we're going to let them wait, right? Because the closer they are to death, the faster we're going to get it and the more taxes we're going to be able to charge on it. But what if there was a different way? What if you could control when you pay the taxes, at what levels you pay the taxes, and then when the distribution comes, those distributions could even possibly be tax-free. For some of our clients, we're able to, over time, right? And we're not evading taxes. We're not running away from the IRS and selling them, you can't have our money. We all have to pay taxes. We made the deal whenever we put those dollars into those pre-tax vehicles that we would pay taxes. But we can be very structured and intelligent about when we pay them, how we pay them, and what amount. And so that way, when those distributions come out to us, they're completely tax-free, right? And if you are 5 years away from retirement or even in retirement, it's not too late. Should you have put money into a Roth? Yes. Are we past that? Absolutely. Well, maybe. You could still be putting money into Roth, right? Like there's no reason to not do that. But there is a way for us to start working on getting that income to be as tax-free as humanly possible. And then that, of course, brings me back to that income. So what do you want your income to look like in retirement? How do we want that to look? So for some of you, again, you are the Social Security people. You're like, I can live off of Social Security. I don't need any other dollars. But we just found out that maybe we should be talking about the taxes on those dollars, because we might want to control the amount of taxes that actually go out. But then if you're somebody who says, you know what, I saved this money, I put it away, I want this money for me, that's why I put it there, then let's talk about how are we going to do those distributions? How are we going to make sure that we're paying the least amount of taxes? Because if you're somebody who says, oh no, for my life, I really need like $150,000 or $200,000. Well, great, but I got news for you. There's this thing called IRMA, where if you did really well and you saved a bunch of money and now you're taking it out to spend it, and you start bumping up against these thresholds, there's all of a sudden this Medicare penalty that happens because, again, you did really well. And it feels like a penalty because all of a sudden, for what everybody else gets for a certain price, because you did well and because you saved and because now you'd like to use your money, you get to pay extra for the benefit that everybody else gets to pay less. My guess is that doesn't feel good. My guess is that feels like one more way that the federal government has come after you and they're getting to your money. Because I got to tell you, it's interesting, because in the world, we hear all of these things where it's like, oh, the rich can pay the taxes, and we want people with money to pay those taxes. Well, obviously you're not going to get blood from a turnip. If you don't have any money, it ain't going to get taxed. That's the way it works. However, if you have all of the money in the world and you're super rich and all of these things, there's all of these tax breaks that you can take advantage. It's really the people in the middle. It's all of those people who worked hard, saved much, and really worked to amass the amount of money that they have to be able to retire on. They're the ones that are going to suffer. They're the ones who are going to pay the most in taxes. They're the ones who are going to get hit with all the penalties, unless they talk to someone like me, unless they work with a team like I have to be able to reduce down those taxes and to maybe even effectively divorce the IRS altogether. I know that sounds like a bold claim. That is a wild claim. But for some of our clients, even though they're not poor, we can pay the IRS what they're due and cut it off right there. Stop it completely. So I have clients now that we've worked with for years to get into a position where the IRS doesn't even care about them anymore, because all of their income is now tax-free. Can you imagine? Right? Like, think about that. Think about all of the taxes you've paid over your entire life and then getting into a position where you no longer have to pay them. And by the way, if we get you into this position, this really amazing position, then when you transfer those dollars to your family, they're also tax-free for 10 years after your death. And there can be additional benefits. And I could talk on this for hours. I know you don't want to spend hours with me. Well, hopefully, we're going to have lots of these podcasts, but we're going to try to divide it out into bite-sized chunks, because we want your retirement to be amazing. We want you to have the ability to do exactly what it is that you want to do. We want you to be able to travel. We want you to be able to look at the different things. We need to look at things like inflation. A cheeseburger today is going to cost twice as much in 10 years. I don't know about you, but if you, I assume if you're getting ready to retire, you can remember it too. But I remember whenever the deals were like, hey, you can get a cheeseburger for $1. Right? Or you can pick one up there was even a time when I was a kid where one of the fast food restaurants, like, they did it based on the temperature outside. So, if it was 39 degrees on Sunday, you could get 39-cent cheeseburgers. And so, that's fun and that's great. But today you're going to pay $10, right? And 10 years from now, you may be paying $20. And hey, by the way, what happens if I've got to get a roof? Or what if I need a new car? What if I don't want to live in the same car for the rest of my life? What is that going to look like? And really having somebody to do all of that, but also to manage your silent partner, the IRS, because whether or not you know it, if you're not careful, you'll have to carry them too. Then you really need somebody who looks at it from all angles, talks about inflation, talks about those things that can come along the road, because we need to make sure that that money is going to show up for you every single year, that it's not going to disappear, that that income is going to look the same year after year after year, or actually that it's going to increase. Or maybe for the first 10 years of retirement, you're going to travel and you're going to take the kids to go do things. And you know that, so you want to spend extra money in those first couple years. Great. Let's plan for it. Let's make sure that we've done it the right way. We don't want to just skimp by. We want to enjoy life. That's the point, right? We want to be able to spend our money and spend it well. And my guess is that shoveling it to the IRS was not your first priority, right? We want to make sure that these buckets are working together. We've got the income bucket. It's going to be there year after year. We've got the future bucket. That's the one that's going to be there for us in inflation. We've got the right now bucket. We've got the, hey, well, long-term care, nobody wanted it, right? I didn't want to have that stroke. I didn't want to get dementia or Alzheimer's. But when it comes along, it doesn't keep my spouse from being able to function. We don't have to decide, well, do we pay for the long-term care facility or do we pay, the light bill? Do we pay for groceries? How are we going to handle this? Because somebody took the time to look at all of the things that could come along in this distribution phase when we're no longer contributing and we're living off of the money that we've amassed, to make sure that you are in the best position possible, that we know where the speed bumps are, that we know what our silent partner, the IRS, is going to do and whether or not we can get rid of them. And so I hope today has been educational. I hope that, you have learned something. I hope that it comes to you in the very best way and that you feel good about what we've talked about. If this episode made you think differently, then that's exactly what this podcast was designed to do. Just a quick reminder, this podcast is for educational purposes only and shouldn't be considered legal, tax, or financial advice. Always consult with a qualified professional about your particular situation, because your particular situation deserves more than guesswork. It deserves intention. If you found this information valuable, please like and subscribe and share it with a friend. We'll see you next week.